The fence line runs straight for miles. No curves, no compromise, just iron posts every 50 feet cutting through New Mexico high country like a surveyor's dream made real. On the south side, wildflowers push through volcanic rock where hikers pay $300 a night to photograph elk. On the north side, crumbling foundation stones mark where families once built homes, raised children, buried neighbors, before the papers came. The wind moves through both sides equally, indifferent to ownership. Between 1860 and 1891, over 1,700,000 acres changed hands through courts, patents, and blood. The question isn't whether the land remembers. The question is whether what happened here was legal empire building or the largest property theft in American history. If you enjoy these documentaries, please like, subscribe, and comment what ranch you would like to see covered next. The patent claims the impossible. It arrives in 1879. It's a government document, leather-bound, gold-embossed, signed by the President of the United States, and it grants ownership of 1,714,764.94 acres of New Mexico and Colorado high country to a company most locals have never heard of. The paper is 9 inches by 14 inches. The land it describes is 2,679 square miles, larger than Delaware, larger than Rhode Island, large enough to swallow most European principalities and still have room for their neighbors. This isn't a ranch deed or a homestead claim or a mining patent. This is something else entirely. A property instrument so vast it doesn't fit existing categories, a legal invention that turns an area the size of a small nation into a single asset that can be bought, sold, mortgaged, and defended in court. The document exists. The question is what it actually creates. In real estate terms, the patent does 3 things simultaneously. It erases boundary uncertainty. The vague Mexican-era descriptions of landmarks and watercourses become survey lines precise to the foot. It transforms contested space into enforceable parcels. Every acre now has coordinates, every corner a monument, every edge a line someone can stand on and say, this side mine, that side yours. And it converts a historical claim into legal property, something that can generate income through rents and leases, something that can be leveraged as collateral, something worth killing for. Before the patent, the Maxwell grant is an argument. After the patent, it's a balance sheet. The numbers tell their own story. On May 19, 1879, the United States government issues patent number 444 to the Maxwell Land Grant and Railway Company. The acreage, 1,714,764.94, appears in black ink on government paper. 9 years earlier, on December 31, 1869, a court decision suggested the grant should be limited to 22 square leagues, which equals 97,424.8 acres. The patent contains 17 times more land than the earlier court decision allowed. Nobody explains the math. The map that accompanies the patent shows boundaries running from the Cimarron River north into Colorado, from the Sangre de Cristo Peaks east across high plains grassland. Inside those boundaries, mining camps, homesteads, irrigation ditches, cemeteries, schools. People who've lived there for decades, some since before the Mexican War, some who arrived during the Colorado Gold Rush, some born in houses their parents built on what they believed was public land. The patent doesn't acknowledge them. It doesn't need to. In property law, title isn't about occupation or use or history. Title is about paper, and now the company has the best paper the federal government can issue. Chapter 2. The ghost boundaries. Mexican words don't survive American courts. The grant begins in 1841. January, specifically, though the exact day gets lost in translation between Mexican administrative records and American legal proceedings that will argue over those records for the next 50 years. A man named Guadalupe Miranda and another named Carlos Beaubien petitioned the governor of New Mexico for land. The petition describes boundaries the way Spanish and Mexican land grants always describe boundaries, not with measurements and coordinates, but with landmarks, watersheds, and natural features that everyone local would recognize and nobody distant could verify. The grant describes one edge as running to a certain creek, another to a mountain peak, visible from a particular vantage point, a third to where two streams converge during spring runoff. These aren't vague descriptions because the petitioners are careless. They're vague because the land itself is the document. You read it by walking it, by knowing which cottonwood marks the corner, by understanding that the boundary follows the ridgeline until you can see the mesa that marks the next turn. This works fine under Mexican law. Land belongs to people who use it, who improve it, who live on it, and make it productive. Boundaries matter less than occupancy. Disputes get settled by neighbors and local officials who can ride out and look at the actual ground and decide whose cattle have been grazing where and whose irrigation ditches run through which meadows. The system is flexible, local, based on relationships and presence. It assumes the people making decisions know the landscape and the community and can make judgments that account for both. Then the Mexican War ends. New Mexico becomes United States territory, and suddenly every Spanish and Mexican land grant has to be confirmed or rejected under an entirely different legal framework. American property law doesn't care about landmarks or local knowledge or who's been using the land. American property law wants surveys. It wants township and range designations. It wants measurements in feet and chains, coordinates that can be plotted on maps in Washington by people who will never see the actual mountains or creeks or ridge lines being described. The Maxwell grant petition, written in Spanish by men who assumed their audience would be officials who knew northern New Mexico geography, now has to be translated not just into English, but into a completely different way of thinking about what land ownership means. The problem isn't translation. The problem is transformation. When the United States Congress confirms the grant on June 21, 1860, what exactly is Congress confirming? The original Mexican boundaries as described, landmarks subject to interpretation, flexible edges that account for seasonal water flow and traditional use patterns? Or some fixed American version that will eventually need survey lines and monuments and coordinates? Nobody knows yet. The confirmation language is careful, diplomatic, deliberately ambiguous. It confirms the grant as described in the original petition, but it doesn't explain how to convert 19th-century Mexican boundary descriptions into 19th-century American survey lines. That problem gets left for later, and later arrives with lawyers, surveyors, courts, and two completely incompatible systems trying to describe the same piece of ground. Chapter 3. The Federal Seal. Federal power makes it real. Congress acts on June 21, 1860. The date matters. Timing always matters when empires shift from one legal system to another, because confirmation isn't validation. Congress doesn't investigate the original Mexican grant, doesn't send surveyors to verify boundaries, doesn't hold hearings to determine if Guadalupe Miranda and Carlos Beaubien actually fulfilled the settlement requirements that Mexican law imposed on land grantees. Congress simply confirms that the grant exists and that the United States government recognizes it as a legitimate property claim under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the document that ended the Mexican War and established how Spanish and Mexican land grants would be handled in newly acquired American territory. What confirmation does, what it really does, beneath all the diplomatic language, is transform a Mexican administrative decision into an American legal instrument. This transformation carries weight. Before confirmation, the Maxwell Grant is a claim that exists in Mexican records and local memory but has no standing in United States courts. After confirmation, it becomes property that American judges must recognize, American law must protect, American enforcement mechanisms must defend. The Act doesn't grant new land, it acknowledges existing claims. But acknowledgement from Congress means those claims can now be surveyed under American methods, patented under American procedures, and most importantly, enforced through American courts with American sheriffs and American legal processes that settlers who arrived thinking they were homesteading public land don't necessarily understand or have resources to fight. The grant isn't property yet. It's permission to fight over property? The confirmation language is brief. It names the grant, references the original Mexican petition, and instructs the Surveyor General of New Mexico to survey and mark the boundaries. What it doesn't do is specify how large those boundaries should be or how to resolve ambiguities in the original Mexican descriptions. That ambiguity will matter. It will matter tremendously, because the difference between what Mexican boundary descriptions might mean and what American surveys will eventually claim they mean is measured not in acres, but in entire communities, their homes, their fields, their futures. In 1860, most of this is still theoretical. The Civil War is starting. New Mexico is remote territory with limited government infrastructure and even more limited federal attention. The Maxwell Grant exists on paper in Washington, but on the ground in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado, life continues as it has. Mining camps boom and bust, homesteaders stake claims, irrigation ditches get dug, cattle graze open range. The confirmation creates legal potential. It establishes that someone with enough money and legal expertise could eventually use federal courts to enforce boundaries not yet surveyed and control land not yet measured. But potential isn't power, not yet. Power requires the next steps, the surveys, the patents, the writs, the deputies, the courtroom decisions that turn congressional acknowledgement into physical removal. Those steps are coming, just not immediately. Chapter 4. The Narrowing. The company rejects the limitation. A court speaks in December. December 31st, 1869, the last day of the year, the last day of a decade, a federal judge named Cox delivers a decision about how large the Maxwell Grant should actually be. The opinion cites Mexican law, examines the original grant language, and concludes that grants of this type were limited to 22 square leagues. The math is precise. 22 square leagues equals 97,424.8 acres, which works out to about 152 square miles. This is still enormous territory, larger than many eastern counties, big enough to hold multiple towns and hundreds of farms. But it's a limit. It's a ceiling. It's a legal boundary that suggests the grant, while valid, while confirmed by Congress on June 21st, 1860, cannot be infinitely large. The Cox decision creates something valuable, not just for settlers hoping the grant will be contained, but for the company itself, because uncertainty is expensive. Investors won't pay top dollar for claims that might evaporate in future litigation, Lenders won't loan against boundaries that courts haven't settled. The Maxwell grant, confirmed but unsurveyed, exists in a kind of legal limbo where it's too uncertain to leverage properly and too contested to sell easily. The Cox decision, even though it limits the grant to less than 100,000 acres, actually increases its value in financial terms. It gives potential buyers and creditors something concrete to evaluate. It turns speculation into calculation. What the company needs now is compliance. Accept the Cox limit, survey 97,000 acres, get a patent for that amount, and convert the whole thing into clean title that can be mortgaged, subdivided, and sold as needed. 100,000 acres of certain property is worth more than 2 million acres of contested claims. This is basic real estate math. The smart play is to take the win, formalize the boundaries, and move forward with development plans that don't require constant litigation. The Cox decision offers an exit from ambiguity, a chance to trade maximum acreage for maximum certainty. The company doesn't take it. Instead, the grant will be surveyed for far more than Cox allowed. The patent, when it finally arrives in 1879, will contain over 1,700,000 acres, 17 times what Cox suggested was legally permissible. Between the court decision in 1869 and the patent in 1879 lies a decade of administrative maneuvering that somehow transforms a legal limit into a launching point. The company doesn't accept limits. The details of how this happens will wind through survey orders, rejected plats, new instructions, political pressure, and bureaucratic decisions that occur largely out of public view. What matters for understanding the financial strategy is this. Limiting the grant to Cox numbers would have made it profitable. Expanding it beyond Cox numbers makes it an empire, but an empire that will require enforcement mechanisms far more aggressive than rent collection. Because when you claim 17 times what a federal court said you could have, you're not just pushing legal boundaries. You're creating a different kind of property entirely, one where title doesn't come from acceptance, but from overwhelming anyone who questions it. Chapter 5. The Iron Compass. The first survey fails immediately. Survey work begins in January. January 13, 1871, a federal surveyor receives orders to mark the Maxwell grant boundaries according to the original Mexican descriptions and whatever guidance the courts and land office can provide. This is technical work that determines everything. Where the surveyor places monuments becomes law. Where the surveyor draws lines on plats becomes property. The difference between a boundary running along one side of a creek versus the other can mean the difference between a homestead inside or outside the grant, between a family keeping their land or losing it to company lawyers. Surveying isn't neutral measurement. It's power made visible, chains and compasses and iron posts that transform disputed space into coordinates that courts will enforce. The surveyor carries instruments that speak a different language than the Mexican grant. The original grant from January 1841 describes boundaries using landmarks. Follow this river to that mountain, from the peak to where 3 streams converge, along ridges that local residents would recognize, but that shift names and interpretations across decades. Mexican boundary descriptions assume human knowledge of terrain. American surveys demand mathematical precision, township lines, range numbers, section corners marked with iron posts set in stone mounds. The surveyor's job is translation. But translation between incompatible systems isn't neutral. It's interpretation with legal consequences. The first survey comes back quickly, May 19, 1871, Just 4 months after the order, the surveyor submits a plat and field notes. The speed should be impressive. Instead, it raises questions. The grant covers hundreds of square miles of mountainous terrain with few roads, harsh weather, and landmarks that Mexican grant language describes in ways that don't translate cleanly to American township and range systems. A thorough survey should take longer. The submitted survey gets rejected. The official record doesn't specify exactly why, but rejected surveys usually mean boundary claims that exceed what the Land Office considers justified by the original grant language, or survey work that doesn't meet technical standards, or plats that conflict with other confirmed claims in ways that will create litigation nightmares. What happens during rejection is administrative discretion. No public hearings, no settler input, no newspaper coverage of bureaucrats in Washington deciding which interpretation of vague Mexican boundaries will prevail. The Land Office reviews the surveyor's work against the grant petition, against Cox's decision suggesting 22 square leagues, against whatever political and economic pressures exist in 1871, when the grant has already changed hands multiple times and accumulated investors whose returns depend on the surveyor's line placement. This is where property gets made, not in dramatic court battles, but in administrative offices where technical objections to survey methodology can mask disagreements about how generous to be when translating Mexican land descriptions into American acreage. 7 years pass. 7 years is a long time in property disputes, long enough for people to build homes thinking they're on public land, long enough for communities to form around assumptions about who owns what, long enough for the Maxwell grant to change hands and accumulate investors whose returns depend on maximum acreage. During these years, the grant exists in limbo. 7 years is long enough for people to build homes they'll lose. Congress confirmed it in 1860. Cox limited it in 1869. But without an approved survey, the boundaries remain uncertain in ways that make the land harder to leverage financially, harder to subdivide for sale, impossible to defend systematically through eviction proceedings. Uncertainty is expensive. It reduces land value, limits borrowing capacity, delays returns on investment. The longer the survey remains unapproved, the more pressure builds to resolve the boundary question in ways that maximize acreage. On February 9, 1878, new survey instructions go out. Whatever caused the first survey's rejection has apparently been resolved through administrative channels that don't leave convenient paper trails. The new surveyor, perhaps the same surveyor with new instructions, will take most of a year to complete the work. This suggests either more careful methodology or more extensive claims requiring additional time to document. The survey progresses through seasons: spring field work, measuring distances and setting monuments, summer work at higher elevations once snow melts, fall completion as weather deteriorates, winter drafting of final plats in offices far from the land being mapped. December 26, 1878, the Surveyor General approves the final plat. The approved survey transforms the grant. The plat shows over 1,700,000 acres, enclosed by boundary lines described in bearings and distances that reference township corners and range lines. Field notes document every monument placed, every creek crossed, every change in bearing as boundaries follow terrain. These documents will outlast everyone involved in creating them. They'll sit in archives when the settlers who thought they owned their homesteads are dead, when the company lawyers who filed ejectments are forgotten, when the administrative officials who approved the survey are dust. But the coordinates will remain, permanent, authoritative, legally binding. Property doesn't decay the way memory does. What the survey creates is certainty. Not moral certainty or historical certainty, but legal certainty, the kind that holds up in court. Every corner marked with an iron post, every boundary described in chains and degrees, every parcel assigned coordinates that federal judges can reference in ejectment orders. Before the survey, the grant is a contested claim. After the survey, it's a map that sheriffs can follow when they arrive with writs. The survey doesn't just measure land, it weaponizes it, turns vague Mexican-era boundary descriptions into American property instruments that can be leveraged, mortgaged, subdivided, and, most importantly, enforced against anyone who thought they were settling public domain. The water implications become clear immediately. Streams that settlers used freely now cross surveyed grant boundaries. Springs that served multiple homesteads sit within coordinates the survey assigns to company property. Roads that connected communities now traverse land the survey defines as private. Gates start appearing where paths used to run open. Fences follow survey lines regardless of whether they cut across traditional grazing routes or block access to timber stands. The survey makes these restrictions possible, gives the company coordinates to reference when posting notices, boundaries to cite when filing trespass complaints, monuments to point to when deputies arrive asking why you're on company land. Out here, water matters as much as title. Roads matter. Access to grazing routes matters. And whoever controls the survey controls all of it. The timeline tells its own story without speculation. Survey ordered January 13, 1871. First attempt rejected May 19, 1871. 7-year gap during which boundaries remain uncertain and settlers keep arriving. New instructions, February 9, 1878. Final approval, December 26, 1878. The approved survey claims acreage that exceeds Cox's 97,000-acre suggestion by 17 times, a number that will appear on the patent in 1879 and get validated by the Supreme Court in 1887. Between Cox's limitation and the final survey lies administrative discretion exercised far from public scrutiny, 7 years of maneuvering that produces a plat showing over 1,700,000 acres transformed from disputed claim to enforceable coordinates. Chapter 6. The Multiplication. The grant multiplies 17 times. Put the documents side by side. On one page, Judge Cox's decision from December 31st, 1869, limiting the grant to 22 square leagues, which equals 97,424.8 acres. On the other page, the federal patent issued May 19, 1879, granting 1,714,764.94 acres. The Cox decision suggests the grant should cover about 152 square miles. The patent delivers about 2,679 square miles. This isn't a boundary dispute or a surveying error or a good faith disagreement about where one creek ends and another begins. This is 17 times more land than a federal court said the grant could legally contain, and the United States government signs it anyway. The numbers don't explain themselves. A court decision isn't necessarily binding on the administrative process that issues patents, especially when that court decision isn't the final word from the Supreme Court. But the gap between Cox's limitation and the patent's grant is so enormous it changes the nature of what's being created. Both numbers are legal. Only one survives. At 97,000 acres, the Maxwell grant is a large private landholding that might generate income through ranching, mining leases, and timber sales. At over 1,700,000 acres, it's something else. A territory larger than Rhode Island? A property so vast it requires not just business operations, but enforcement infrastructure. Not just ranch hands, but guards. Not just lawyers, but entire legal departments dedicated to defending boundaries that will be perpetually contested. The patent resets everything. Every calculation about value, every assumption about boundaries, every settler's belief about whether their homestead sits on public or private land, all of it gets rewritten by the acreage on the patent. Properties this size don't function like normal real estate. You can't manage 1,700,000 acres through normal ranching operations. What you can do is extract rents from people already living there, charge tolls for road access, control water sources that entire communities depend on, lease grazing rights at rates set without competition, and use the courts to remove anyone who resists. The patent doesn't create a ranch. It creates a private jurisdiction with its own rules, its own enforcement, and federal backing for both. And here's what matters for understanding what comes next. The company will successfully defend this patent all the way to the Supreme Court. The litigation will take years. The resistance will turn violent. People will die. But in 1887, the Supreme Court will conclude after initial hearings and a rehearing that the grant, survey, and patent are valid and free from fraud. The highest court in the land will look at this 17-fold expansion beyond what Cox suggested and rule it legally sound, which means the whiplash isn't just about administrative discretion or bureaucratic maneuvering. It's about a legal system that allows certain property claims to expand far beyond earlier limitations if you have the resources to push them through every available appeal. Chapter 7. When paper meets skin, title becomes weapon through a process. The process has a name: ejectment. It begins in courtrooms with complaints filed by company lawyers against settlers who thought they owned their land or who homesteaded what they believed was public domain. The complaint alleges trespass, that the defendant is occupying property that belongs to the Maxwell Land Grant and Railway Company, according to the patent issued May 19, 1879. The defendant can argue the patent is invalid, can claim prior rights, can challenge the survey boundaries. But arguing takes money for lawyers, time away from crops and livestock, stamina for litigation that can stretch across years. Most settlers have none of these things. Most lose. When a settler loses, the court issues a writ. A writ of possession, a piece of paper that orders the county sheriff to physically remove the defendant from the disputed property and deliver possession to the company. The writ specifies the boundaries of the contested parcel, names the parties involved, sets a deadline for voluntary departure, and authorizes the use of force if the occupant refuses to leave. The sheriff receives the writ and must execute it. That is the legal term for carrying out a court order, or risk being held in contempt. The sheriff doesn't evaluate whether the eviction is just or whether the settler has a moral claim. The sheriff enforces what the court decided based on title documents the company brought to court, and the settler often couldn't effectively challenge. After the eviction, the sheriff files a return. A sheriff's return is the document that proves the writ was executed, describing what happened when deputies arrived at the property, whether the occupant left voluntarily or required removal, what condition the property was in when possession transferred to the company. These returns are the paper trail of displacement, the official record of families losing homes to title disputes. They're filed in county courthouses, stored in docket books alongside the original complaints and writs. Finding them requires searching through hundreds of ejectment cases across multiple counties over decades. The research pack doesn't include them, but they exist somewhere, waiting for historians willing to spend weeks in courthouse basements matching case numbers to names to properties to outcomes. The company offers an alternative to eviction: stay on the land, pay rent, sign a lease acknowledging company ownership and agreeing to terms the company sets: how much grazing, what improvements are allowed, whether you can sublet or pass occupancy to your children. The rent turns contested occupation into authorized tenancy. It regularizes the relationship between company and occupant while extracting ongoing revenue from land the company now controls not through work, but through legal title. Some settlers accept these terms because staying on familiar land as tenants beats losing it entirely. Others refuse on principle. They won't pay rent for land they cleared and improved, won't accept company authority over territory they believed was public domain or their own homestead. Those who refuse eventually face ejectment proceedings. Taxes create additional pressure. Once the company holds clear title validated by the Supreme Court in 1887, property taxes become the company's responsibility and the company's leverage. The company can afford taxes on 1.7 million acres because it's collecting rents and leases and selling timber and mineral rights across that entire territory. Individual settlers occupying a few hundred acres can't compete with that math. If they refuse to pay rent, the company initiates ejectment. If they try to pay property taxes themselves to establish a competing claim, county tax collectors often reject payment because company title is on record and you cannot pay taxes on land someone else legally owns. The tax system becomes another mechanism, enforcing the patent's boundaries, not through sheriffs, but through administrative procedures that treat the company's claim as authoritative and any competing claim as invalid. Enforcement requires permanent infrastructure. The company needs lawyers on retainer to file new ejectment cases as people continue occupying disputed land or as existing occupants stop paying rent. It needs guards, sometimes called range riders or company police, to patrol boundaries, report trespassers, monitor who is accessing water sources, timber stands, and grazing areas. These guards are a line item in company operations: salaries, horses, weapons, provisions. They are not there to manage cattle. They are there to enforce property rights that many locals still do not recognize as legitimate. Their presence transforms the grant from an abstract legal claim into physical control, with gates across roads, challenges at creeks, and confrontations over fence lines. The enforcement infrastructure costs money every month, and those costs must be covered by income the land generates or by capital the company raises from investors who reportedly paid $1,350,000 for an enterprise that includes enforcement apparatus as much as agricultural assets. Enforcement is an operating expense. Water becomes the primary control mechanism. Out here, the deed matters less than access. A settler can occupy land for years, build a cabin, plant crops, graze livestock, and lose everything when the company fences the creek or charges fees for crossing its property to reach water sources. The grant's boundaries, confirmed by Congress on June 21, 1960, and expanded 17 times beyond Cox's suggested limit of 97,424 acres through the patent issued in 1879, do not just control surface territory. They control everything that makes settlement viable: water for drinking and irrigation, timber for building and fuel, roads for market access, and grazing routes that follow seasonal patterns livestock need. When the company controls these resources through legal title, it does not need to evict every settler. It only needs to control what settlers cannot survive without. Some leave voluntarily when water access is restricted, Others stay and pay whatever the company demands for resources they used freely before the patent transformed contested space into enforced property. What would help us understand the human scale of this process are the documents themselves. The ejectment dockets from Colfax County and Los Animas County list plaintiff and defendant names, hearing dates, and judgments entered. The writs of possession describe specific properties and deadlines for removal. Sheriff's returns document whether removals were completed peacefully or required force. Tax records show who paid property taxes before and after ejectment proceedings. Homestead applications demonstrate how long settlers occupied land before company lawyers arrived. Payroll records show how many guards the company employed and what they were paid to patrol over 1 million acres. Security expense ledgers reveal enforcement as an operational cost rather than a one-time legal battle. These documents exist somewhere in courthouse basements, county archives, historical society collections, and corporate files that passed through multiple owners. Their absence from the research pack does not mean enforcement did not happen. It means we know the machinery existed, but cannot identify most of the people it processed. What we do know is that enforcement at this scale creates two populations: those inside the system who accept company authority and pay rents or leases for land they once thought they owned, and those outside the system who resist, organize, and eventually discover that resistance to a property claim backed by federal patents and Supreme Court validation is resistance to the law itself. The line between these populations isn't fixed. People move from one category to another as circumstances change, as savings run out, as resistance organizing fails, as court decisions consistently favor company title, as the realization sets in that the legal war is over and the company won. The patent transformed 1,700,000 acres from contested territory into company property. The enforcement pipeline transforms that legal fact into physical reality. Evictions, rent collections, controlled access, systematized exclusion. Chapter 8. The Burning. The company office burns in October. October 27, 1870, reported in accounts of what will later be called the Colfax County War, when resistance to the Maxwell grant turns from legal arguments to direct action. The office sits in Elizabethtown, a mining boom town that exists because gold was discovered in the Moreno Valley, because prospectors flooded into what they thought was public land, because mining camps don't wait for property disputes to be settled before staking claims and building infrastructure. The burning is symbolic violence. Destroy the administrative center where rent demands originate, where eviction notices get drafted, where company authority radiates outward across territory that miners believe should be open to individual claims rather than controlled by a single corporate entity with a patent the size of a small nation. Elizabethtown matters because of what's under the ground. Gold, primarily, discovered in the 1860s and worked by individual miners and small operations that assume mineral rights, follow the same homesteading principles that govern agricultural land. But mineral rights don't work that way when a land grant patent covers the surface. The Maxwell grant doesn't just control who can build a house or plant crops. It controls who can dig, who can establish mining claims, who can extract wealth from deposits that prospectors found through their own labor and risk. This is the minerals layer beneath the acreage disputes, a parallel economy where a single property instrument can monopolize not just what grows on the land, but what lies beneath it. The miners organize because they're not homesteaders. They're not families trying to defend small farms. They're workers and independent operators in an industry built on the idea that mineral wealth belongs to whoever has the skill and capital to extract it, not to whoever holds a piece of paper issued in Washington claiming ownership of mountains they've never climbed and creeks they've never followed to their source. The company sees trespassers and squatters. The miners see a monopoly trying to collect rents on deposits they discovered and infrastructure they built with their own money in places the original Mexican grant petitioners probably never visited. The burning doesn't stop the enforcement, it escalates it. Property claims this large don't retreat because locals burn an office, they rebuild the office, hire more guards, file more lawsuits, and wait for federal courts to validate their position. What the burning does accomplish is mark a transition from legal resistance to physical resistance, from arguments about survey boundaries to conflicts over who actually controls access to the land and everything it contains. Elizabethtown will fade as the easy gold runs out and as enforcement pressure makes mining under company authority too expensive for small operators. The boomtown that existed because individuals could stake claims and work them independently will give way to operations that can afford to lease from the company or that have enough capital to fight in court. What we're missing from this chapter are the newspaper accounts themselves, the microfilm records of who reported the burning, what they said about it, whether they framed it as criminal arson or justified resistance. We're missing the names of who organized the resistance and who got arrested for it. We're missing the details that would let us trace specific miners from claim to eviction to whatever they did next. Those records exist somewhere in archives and newspaper collections, but without them, we can only note that resistance happened, that it was organized enough to target the administrative center, and that it failed to stop the larger process it was meant to disrupt. Chapter 9. The Preacher. A man dies in September. September 1875, Reverend Franklin J. Tolby, a Methodist circuit preacher who traveled through mining camps and settlements on what many settlers believed was public land, or at least contested territory where company authority remained uncertain. Tolby's murder, reported in many historical accounts of the Colfax County War, gets treated as a turning point. The moment when organized resistance transforms into something darker, when property disputes become blood feuds, when the enforcement of a federal patent starts generating the kind of violence that draws attention beyond local courtrooms and into regional consciousness. Whether Tolby was killed because of his opposition to the Maxwell grant, or for entirely unrelated reasons, will be debated for years. What's certain is that his death escalates everything. The timing matters. 5 years after the Elizabethtown office burns on October 27, 1870. 4 years before the patent formally issues on May 19, 1879. Tolby dies during the administrative window when the survey has been completed, but the patent hasn't been delivered, when company enforcement is ramping up based on survey lines that haven't yet received final federal approval, when settlers are being pressured to accept company authority over land they've occupied for years. This is the moment of maximum uncertainty, when both sides believe they might still win if they push hard enough. When neither side has exhausted its options for escalation, when violence starts to seem like a viable strategy because legal processes are moving too slowly or producing outcomes that feel unjust. The escalation follows a pattern: legal resistance through 1873, physical resistance, burning the office, increased company enforcement, and then individual deaths that get interpreted through the lens of the larger conflict, whether or not they're directly connected to it. Every death becomes evidence for one narrative or another. Company supporters say it proves settlers are lawless squatters who reject legal authority and resort to violence when courts don't rule their way. Settlers say it proves the company will kill to defend claims that exceed what courts originally allowed. Both narratives feed escalation, each side using violence as justification for more enforcement or more resistance, each death creating pressure for retaliation or protection. What we'd need to understand Tolby's death in its full context are the documents that prove he existed as more than a name in historical accounts. Church records showing his circuit assignments and when he preached in which communities. Cemetery records showing where he's buried and what his gravestone says. Newspaper obituaries from 1875 describing how local papers framed his death as murder, as tragedy, as martyrdom, as crime. Letters or diaries from people who knew him explaining what he actually said about the Maxwell grant and whether that's really why he died. These documents exist somewhere. They're the kind of records that survive in church archives and historical societies. Without them, we can note that Tolby's death gets treated as a turning point in later accounts, but we can't verify the details that would let us understand what actually happened or why. What changes after Tolby is the scale of attention. The conflict stops being a local property dispute and starts being something that needs federal intervention or military presence, or some kind of resolution that goes beyond county sheriffs enforcing ejectment writs. The violence, whether connected to the grant or not, creates risk that affects everyone trying to do business or raise families on land covered by a patent claiming over 1,700,000 acres based on a survey completed on December 26, 1878. Risk changes calculations. It makes enforcement more expensive. It makes settlement less attractive. It turns property into something contended, not just in courtrooms, but in ways that make normal life impossible. The final word comes in 1887. After years of litigation, after appeals and arguments and briefs that stack higher than the survey monuments marking the grant boundaries, the highest court in the United States delivers its conclusion. The grant is valid, the survey is valid, the patent is valid. And after a rehearing that lets the losing side make one more attempt to overturn the decision, the court goes further. The grant, survey, and patent are free from fraud. This isn't a narrow technical ruling or a procedural dismissal. This is comprehensive validation. Every legal challenge that settlers could mount has been heard and rejected. Every argument about Mexican law, survey procedures, acreage limits, and Cox's earlier decision has been evaluated and found insufficient to overcome the patent's authority. The court is deciding specific legal questions. Did Congress have authority to confirm the Mexican grant on June 21, 1860? Yes. Did the survey conducted between January 1871 and December 1878 follow proper procedures? Yes. Does the patent issued May 19, 1879 accurately reflect the confirmed grant as surveyed? Yes. Did the company acquire the grant through legal means? Yes. These are the questions courts can answer, questions about process, documentation, administrative compliance. The justices review the Mexican petition from January 1841, trace its path through congressional confirmation, follow the survey timeline through rejection and resubmission, and conclude that each step, however controversial its outcome, followed legal procedures available at the time. What the court doesn't ask is whether those procedures were just, whether it makes sense that a Mexican grant described using landmarks and watersheds becomes an American patent claiming over 1,700,000 acres. Whether the 17-fold expansion beyond Cox's suggested 97,000-acre limitation represents faithful interpretation of the original grant or administrative capture by well-funded claimants. Whether people who've lived on and improved land for years have moral claims that should override paper title issued in Washington. These questions exist outside judicial review. Courts don't evaluate whether laws are wise, only whether they were followed. And in 1887, the Supreme Court concludes that every legal requirement was satisfied. The decision creates finality. Before 1887, settlers challenging the grant can argue the patent might be overturned, the survey might be invalidated, some higher court might rule differently. Each lawsuit carries possibility. Maybe this judge will see things our way. Maybe this appeal will succeed. Maybe Cox's limitation will be reinstated. After 1887, those possibilities collapse. The Supreme Court is the final arbiter of federal law. When the court validates the grant, survey, and patent, no higher authority exists to reverse that judgment. The law is settled. The title is clear. The enforcement can begin systematically without fear that future courts will undo the property rights being defended. This matters immediately for local courts handling ejectment cases. Before the Supreme Court ruling, county judges in New Mexico and Colorado territories might hesitate when company lawyers file complaints against settlers. Maybe the underlying title is questionable. Maybe federal courts will eventually limit the grant. Maybe dockets full of eviction cases will get reversed on appeal. After 1887, those hesitations disappear. The Supreme Court has spoken. Local courts must enforce the law as the highest court has interpreted it. When company lawyers present the patent and reference the Supreme Court decision, county judges have no discretion to question the title. They can only determine whether the defendant is occupying land within the surveyed boundaries and whether the company has proper documentation. If both are true, the ejectment proceeds. The writ issues. The sheriff executes removal. Finality also transforms the enforcement calculus for the company. Before 1887, aggressive eviction campaigns carry risk. What if you remove hundreds of families and then federal courts overturn your title? You've created enemies, destroyed goodwill, and potentially face countersuits for wrongful eviction. After 1887, those risks evaporate. The Supreme Court called the grant, survey, and patent free from fraud. That language matters. It's not just validation, it's exoneration. The court isn't saying the company's claims are technically legal despite being morally dubious. It's saying the entire process was legitimate. This gives the company confidence to pursue evictions systematically, to demand rents and leases aggressively, to fence access points and control water sources without worrying that courts will later rule such actions were based on invalid title. For settlers, the decision eliminates the last refuge. You can't argue anymore that the grant exceeds its legal boundaries. The Supreme Court examined Cox's limitation and decided the survey and patent don't violate it. You can't argue the survey was fraudulent. The court specifically concluded it was free from fraud. You can't argue that Mexican boundary descriptions don't support the massive acreage. The court reviewed the original petition and found the patent consistent with it. Every legal argument that might have worked is foreclosed by 1887. The only questions remaining are factual. Are you on grant land according to the survey? Do you have documentation the company recognizes? If no to either question, the ejectment proceeds. Your actual history on the land, how long you've been there, how much labor you've invested, whether you believed in good faith you were on public domain, becomes legally irrelevant. There's no fourth option. The decision transforms property from disputed territory into settled law. Resistance to the grant before 1887 can claim legal uncertainty. We are fighting for our interpretation of boundaries against the company's interpretation, and maybe courts will agree with us. Resistance after 1887 means defying settled law backed by Supreme Court authority. Sheriffs executing eviction orders aren't choosing sides in a property dispute. They're enforcing federal court decisions validated by the nation's highest judicial body. Settlers who refuse to leave aren't defending contested claims. They're violating law that the Supreme Court has made clear. The violence that follows, and it will follow, happens because some people refuse to accept that legal victory equals actual justice. That paper title trumps lived experience that the court's conclusion about fraud and validity should override what settlers know about how the grant expanded and who benefited from that expansion. What the Supreme Court doesn't address, what it can't address, because it's not within the scope of judicial review, is whether any of this should have happened. Courts evaluate legal questions. Was the grant properly confirmed? Was the survey conducted according to procedure? Does the patent comply with administrative requirements? The answers to those questions in 1887 are all yes. But the question underneath everything, whether it's just or wise or sustainable to convert over 2,000 square miles of contested territory into a single corporate landholding defended by federal law enforcement, that question never gets asked in a way courts can answer. Property law doesn't evaluate fairness, it evaluates title. And the Maxwell grant now has the clearest title the American legal system can provide. Violence crosses state lines in 1888. 1 year after the Supreme Court validates the grant, survey, and patent in 1887, conflict erupts in Colorado Territory, where the Maxwell grant boundaries extend north from New Mexico across what will become Los Animas County. The incident at Stonewall, reported in historical summaries as involving violence and resulting in convictions, demonstrates that Supreme Court decisions don't immediately translate into peaceful compliance. Some settlers, especially those on the Colorado side of the border, either don't know about the ruling, or don't accept that it applies to them, or believe they can resist enforcement through methods that worked before courts settled the legal questions. They're wrong on all counts. The Colorado resistance makes strategic sense from a settler perspective. Colorado became a state in 1876. It's newer, less established, has different county governance structures than New Mexico Territory. Maybe Colorado courts will be more sympathetic to homesteaders. Maybe Colorado sheriffs will be less willing to enforce New Mexico company claims. Maybe distance from the grant's administrative center in New Mexico will create enforcement gaps that settlers can exploit. These calculations fail because federal court orders don't stop at state lines, because the Maxwell grant patent covers land in both territories regardless of local politics, and because the company has resources to enforce boundaries wherever the survey lines run. What happens at Stonewall involves violence serious enough to result in convictions. The historical record confirms this without providing casualty numbers or detailed participant lists. This isn't unusual. Court records often survive when newspaper accounts don't. Conviction records outlast the testimony that produced them, and documentation of outcomes persists while documentation of causes gets lost. What matters for understanding the larger pattern is that resistance continues after legal avenues close, that violence becomes a strategy when courts consistently rule against you, and that the company responds to physical resistance with prosecution rather than negotiation. The enforcement costs keep accumulating. Legal victory doesn't end violence, it justifies it. The company proved its title all the way to the Supreme Court. That should be the end of litigation. But winning in court doesn't make people leave land they've occupied for years. It just gives you legal authority to force them off, which requires deputies, sheriffs, guards, lawyers to prosecute trespassers, and constant vigilance along boundaries that stretch across two territories. Land this large doesn't generate passive income. It generates ongoing operational expenses that only make financial sense if you're collecting enough in rents, leases, and resource extraction to cover enforcement costs plus profit. The math works for the investors who reportedly paid $1,350,000. The math doesn't work for settlers trying to homestead 160 acres while fighting eviction. The legal victory in 1887 means the patent covering 1,714,764.94 acres now has Supreme Court backing. The violence in 1888 means that backing still requires physical force to maintain. Fast forward to today, and portions of that original patent are marketed as the Vermejo Ranch, over 558,000 acres of what's billed as pristine wilderness and premium hunting grounds. The land that required deputies and convictions to secure in 1888 now requires wealth and reservations to access. The enforcement mechanism changed, the exclusion didn't. Chapter 12. The Atlantic Distance. The company is foreign. The Maxwell Land Grant and Railway Company, which has spent decades defending its patent in American courts and enforcing its boundaries with American sheriffs, is described in the official record as organized under the laws of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. The land is in New Mexico and Colorado. The patent is issued by the United States government. The enforcement happens through federal courts and county deputies. But the company, the entity that actually owns over 1.7 million acres of American territory, is incorporated in Europe. This isn't hidden or illegal. It's just rarely mentioned in accounts that focus on the violence and evictions and legal battles happening on the ground. Capital crosses oceans effortlessly. The reported sale price of $1.35 million likely involved investors who never saw the Sangre de Cristo Mountains or walked the meadows where settlers built homes or visited the mining camps that burned company offices. They saw financial instruments, shares in a corporation that holds a federal patent for property that generates income through rents, leases, grazing fees, mineral rights, and timber sales. The Netherlands incorporation means those investors enjoy legal protections and tax advantages available under European corporate law while extracting value from American land defended by American law enforcement. It's elegant financial engineering. It's also a form of distance that makes certain kinds of decision-making easier. When you're making enforcement decisions from Amsterdam or The Hague, evicting settlers isn't personal. It's portfolio management. You're not removing neighbors, you're clearing trespassers from income-producing assets. You're not destroying communities, you're resolving title disputes that threaten returns on investment. The physical distance matches the emotional distance. The corporate structure creates layers of separation between people who profit from the grant and people who get removed from it. Shareholders don't serve eviction notices. They don't testify in ejectment proceedings. They don't witness families loading possessions onto wagons after losing court cases they couldn't afford to fight properly. They review quarterly reports showing rental income and legal expenses and overall profitability. Distance makes certain decisions easier. This is what mature capital looks like. Not individuals claiming land they want a ranch or mine, but corporations structured to maximize returns while minimizing legal exposure and tax obligations. The Maxwell Grant isn't just big. It's sophisticated. It uses American property law to secure title, American courts to eliminate challenges, American law enforcement to remove occupants, and European corporate law to protect investors. It's jurisdiction shopping at scale. Each legal system provides a different advantage, and the company accesses all of them simultaneously, while settlers trying to defend their homes can barely afford lawyers who understand local land law, much less international corporate structures. The Netherlands designation also adds a geopolitical dimension. This isn't just New Mexico territory or Colorado state resources, it's American land controlled by foreign capital organized under foreign law. In 1891, that might not generate much attention. By later decades, when questions about foreign ownership of American resources become politically sensitive, the corporate distance that seemed like smart business practice starts looking like a vulnerability. But in 1891, after the Supreme Court validated the patent in 1887, the Netherlands incorporation is just another fact in the permanent record, a detail that explains how property this large actually functions as an investment vehicle rather than a place where people live. Chapter 13. The Rebranding. Luxury erases displacement. Drive through northern New Mexico today, and you'll encounter signs for the Vermejo Park Ranch, marketed as over 558,000 acres of pristine wilderness where guests pay thousands of dollars to fish for trophy trout, hunt elk on guided expeditions, and experience what the promotional materials call authentic Western heritage in accommodations that rival luxury hotels. The Maxwell land. Grant doesn't appear in the brochures. The ejectment orders and violence and Supreme Court battles don't feature in the guest experience. What you get is carefully managed access to land that took decades of legal warfare to consolidate, now packaged as exclusive recreation for people who can afford reservation fees that would have fed a settler family for years. Ted Turner reportedly purchased the property from Pennzoil in 1996. This is how empires change hands in the modern era, not through Mexican petitions or congressional confirmations or survey disputes, but through corporate acquisitions where one energy company sells land assets to a media billionaire who wants a private hunting preserve. The transaction probably took weeks to negotiate and hours to close. The original consolidation, from 1860 congressional confirmation through 1879 patent through 1887 Supreme Court validation, took nearly 3 decades and left bodies in its wake. Both processes achieve the same result: concentrated ownership of territory most people can't access. Other fragments got carved off for different purposes. The Maxwell National Wildlife Refuge occupies about 3,699 acres of what was once Grant land, federal property again, but managed for conservation rather than settlement or resource extraction. Fisher's Peak State Park in Colorado covers 19,200 acres that opened to public access in recent years after being closed to most people for over a century. These are the preservation outcomes: land protected from development, habitat conserved, species protected. They're genuine conservation vision. They also represent a particular vision of what land is for: looking at, not living on. The refuge and park welcome visitors, but don't allow the kind of permanent occupation that settlers attempted in the 1870s. The scale reveals itself when you line up the numbers. Over 558,000 acres marketed as Vermejo, about 3,699 acres designated as wildlife refuge, 19,200 acres accessible as state park. The property changes from 1996 onward happen without violence because ownership is no longer contested. When Turner's company controls access, when federal agencies manage refugees, when state parks require entrance fees and enforce operating hours, exclusion doesn't require sheriffs. It requires gates, permits, reservation systems, and prices that filter visitors before they arrive. The original patent from 1879 claimed over 1,700,000 acres. Today's fragments represent different forms of the same principle, land too valuable to leave open to whoever wants to use it. The marketing presents this as progress. Land that was exploited for resources, mining, grazing, timber, is now protected. Land that was fought over violently is now managed peacefully. Land that represented displacement and loss now offers recreation and conservation. All of this is true. What's also true is that the transition from working landscape to luxury playground happened after the people who wanted to work the land got removed through processes that the Supreme Court validated in 1887. Preservation came after exclusion. The parks and refuges and private ranches exist on foundations built through ejectment writs and legal warfare that established certain ownership claims as unassailable. The rebranding is real, so is the continuity. Chapter 14. What survives? Property survives. People disappear. The Mexican grant petition from January 1841, reproduced in court filings, recited in legal briefs, preserved because it's the foundation of every claim that follows. The Act of Congress from June 21, 1860, confirming the grant and setting everything in motion. Judge Cox's decision from December 31, 1869, suggesting the 22 square league limit that the patent will later exceed by 17 times. The survey timeline, running from January 1871 through December 1878, documented in administrative records because government surveyors keep meticulous field notes. The patent itself, issued May 19, 1879, claiming over 1,700,000 acres in black ink on federal paper, and the Supreme Court opinions from 1887 declaring the grant, survey, and patent valid and free from fraud. These documents exist because institutions preserve their own authority. The paper spine of the Maxwell grant is complete, detailed, accessible. You can trace the legal transformation from Mexican petition to American property through documents that were designed to survive. They're in archives, libraries, government repositories. They're the official story, the version that property law recognizes and courts enforce. What's missing is everything else. The Maxwell Cattle Company's operational records, how many people they employed, what wages they paid, how they actually ran an enterprise covering over 1 million acres. The complete list of ejectment cases and eviction proceedings, individual names, specific properties, outcomes of hundreds or thousands of cases where settlers lost homes to title disputes. Company correspondence about enforcement strategies, rent collection, dealings with resistors, military communications about deployments or presence during the conflict years. These documents might exist somewhere in private collections or uncatalogued archives or family attics, or they might be gone, destroyed deliberately, lost to fire or flood or simple neglect, discarded when they seemed irrelevant to whoever inherited them. Power keeps archives. Displacement doesn't. The absence shapes what we can know. We have the legal skeleton, but not the human tissue. We know the Maxwell grant was validated and enforced, but we can't trace most individual evictions from complaint to removal. We know resistance happened and sometimes turned violent, but we're missing the detailed accounts that would let us understand motivations, calculate casualties, identify who paid the heaviest prices. We know the company operated successfully enough to attract foreign investment, but we don't have payrolls or commissary records or labor contracts that would show how wealth extracted from the land got distributed among the people who actually worked it. This isn't unusual. Property records survive because they matter to ongoing ownership claims. Human stories survive only if someone deliberately preserves them, and preservation requires resources, institutional support, belief that these particular lives warrant documentation. The Maxwell Grant's paper trail is pristine because property is power, and power keeps records. The settler stories are fragmentary because displaced people don't usually get archives. What survives tells us as much about what we value as about what happened. Stand at that fence line again, where flowers grow on one side and foundation stones crumble on the other. The boundary is clear, legal, enforceable. The patent that created it is validated by the highest court in the land. The documents proving all of this are preserved, catalogued, accessible. And on the side with the ruins, no plaques explain who lived there, no markers identify what was lost. No archive holds the letters they might have written about watching sheriffs approach with writs they couldn't afford to fight. The land remembers differently than paper does.